We know last year, Tom Brevoort and the X-Men office tried their damnedest to find somebody with a name to take over the X-Men line. One of those names that was thrown out there that seemed a bit far-fetched was Jim Lee. We have a bit of a follow-up on that, where some of that information came from. And then some new information that Jim Lee himself might have been the one instigating all of this, Doc.
Honestly, if that's the case, then more fucking power to the man. It seemed really out of left field to begin with. Nobody thought that there was any real validity to it, but now it does look like Jim might have been deciding he needed some bargaining power for his deal over at DC.
And Doc, as we're the world's leading X-Men comic book fans, is this something that would have gotten you salivating over wanting to buy an X-Men comic book?
It definitely would have helped. I can't say for absolute certain 100% it would have blown the doors off, because it is 2024. It is not 1994. But I guarantee Jim involved as the writer, as the group editor, as whatever, doubles, if not quadruples, the current sales. And it makes the product kind of go back to don't miss territory.
Well, where all this information came from, earlier this year, Rob Liefeld stated on his Robservations podcast, Marvel Comics approached Jim Lee to leave DC Comics in spring of 2023 and come to Marvel to return to draw X-Men and have Jim Lee take over the books after the Krakoan age wraps up this year. With a very healthy offer, Jim passed. The reason given, according to Lifeld, is that he has not done much interior work since drawing 10 pages an issue on Suicide Squad for the first 7 issues with Rob Williams back in 2016, and he didn't want to commit to such a run and the intense and laborious work and deadlines needed at this time of his life, and that his executive career gives his family holiday time that drawing on an artboard may not, though Liefeld believes that Jim Lee will draw the X-Men sometime in his life. And that made sense, because it did sound like they literally went to everybody, and the biggest name out there would have been Jim Lee. And apparently his contract was coming up at DC, and throwing a fat stack of cash out there to bring him back to X-Men just to even do covers. It sounded like they wanted to do interior work, which I do think is a pipe dream. The last time he committed to interior work, he did half an issue and stopped.
I'm pretty sure that we all knew that Marvel got desperate, where they went to the ones that were probable, then the ones that were possible, then they went to the ones that were kind of a stretch, and then they got to the point of just straight up pipe dream offers to people, because nobody would take this gig. They got desperate, and that's the reason why we have the current lineup, is because it's showing exactly how desperate they really were. When Gail Simone is your headliner for a brand, your brand is dead. I'm sorry, regardless of how much you might like Gail, she has never been a marquee talent or a headliner in any way, shape, or form. And she never will be, unfortunately. So them going to Jim as something completely outlandish, they were throwing everything at the wall because nothing was sticking. Big risk, but big reward if he accepted it.
And the new information that we're having, that it wasn't exactly a Marvel Comics thing, it was actually a Jim Lee thing, is coming from Bleeding Cool, who states it was Jim Lee who made the approach to Marvel to consider his options with the Deadpool and Wolverine movie then coming, the X-Men 97 cartoon revival based on much of Jim Lee's work, and his observation that most people were asking him to sign his X-Men comics rather than Batman. Something was in the air. Discussions had revolved around Jim Lee being part of the X-Men movie franchise, working with Kevin Feige as well, and working for Marvel doing X-Men covers, short stories, and the like. And that kind of makes sense. I imagine if he was at cons and he was noticing people don't want me to sign Batman anymore, but they still love me signing X-Men comic books. The MCU has been much more successful. The proliferation of his ideas and character designs is still living on at Marvel and Disney. Deadpool and Wolverine right on the horizon. X-Men 97 borrowing from all of his ideas. It would have been a prime time spot to consider his options. And if he could have gotten a foot in the door into movies, which could have been much more lucrative.
And I don't say this to sound like he's devious or anything like that, but the man is a phenomenal opportunist. When he sees an opportunity in front of him in order to raise his profile, take care of himself or his family better, he 100% takes it, to have more power to grow himself. He did it when he went with the Image guys. He did it when he kind of used his clout and his marketability to sort of kind of push Chris Claremont off X-Men unintentionally to get, Bob Harris on his side. He did it when he basically made Wildstorm for sale. He can absolutely read the market, and I think all of those things are correct. More people were asking him to sign his X-Men stuff. Deadpool and Wolverine was coming out. X-Men 97 was a hit. The X-Men are going to get introduced to the MCU soon. And the MCU, while it is kind of on a little bit of a downslide, the X-Men coming in has the potential to rejuvenate it. And his contract is up. Plus the comics. The X-Men comics are in a terrible, terrible spot. He's friends with all these people in the industry. He knew that everyone was turning them down. Him putting his name out there and basically offering an olive branch, or in the case, a potentially winning Powerball ticket for Tom Brevoort to bring Jim back in order to make sure that he's not negotiating with Warner Brothers in a vacuum. He
wanted leverage. It was a leverage play.
Absolutely. He took the opportunity to get the leverage that he needed to get the deal he wanted. Now, I don't think he particularly cared about going back to DC, but at the same time, as far as I'm aware, he still does have, as a result of his, the DC's purchase of Wildstorm, he does still have a lot of financial interest in the stake with DC. I don't think he wants to leave because he doesn't want to leave that. He doesn't want to lose that or lose his influence there. But it was a great opportunity for him to add leverage that he hasn't had in the last few negotiations, other than the fact that DC doesn't have anybody fucking else to do the job. He took advantage of it, and more power to him for doing so.
He wanted to create leverage in the market, and there's no better leverage that anybody in all of comic books could create better than Jim Lee stating, X-Men is about to be rebooted. We've got an X-Men movie. We've got a cartoon based on my designs. People want me to sign X-Men comic books. Things are about to blow up now. I would like a foot in the door with the MCU. Kevin Feige is talking to me right now. Here's an offer. It's pretty substantial. What do you guys have to say? It feels like I'm really wanted over there. Do you want me here? Absolutely. And nobody could pull this out because no one has ever done what Jim Lee did with X-Men #1.
There's only a handful of folks that could theoretically leverage their position the way that Jim was able to. And Jim had all of the stars align to hand him the perfect opportunity. And either option was not bad. Either Warner Brothers makes with whatever demands he wanted, or he makes the jump back to Disney and Marvel, goes and works with Kevin Feige and relaunches X-Men, maybe in a way that makes it actually a desirable brand again. So this is a win-win-win for everyone involved.
Well, it certainly benefited Jim Lee in the end because it didn't happen. He didn't go back to Marvel and X-Men. Jim Lee stayed and re-upped at Warner Brothers as publisher and chief creative officer at DC Comics. One can presume that they compensated him handsomely for not making an X-Men movie with Kevin Feige, and maybe that was his plan all along. Jim Lee is the most consummate businessman in comics and one hell of a poker player after all. And it turns out he was holding a full house and he was able to leverage that and win the deal in the end. But I do not get this, Doc. As great as Jim Lee is, and Jim Lee's great, he's done some really cool stuff with Batman. He's done some amazing covers. When I think about the work that Jim Lee has done at DC, outside of Hush, the art's great, but most of the stories suck. Like everything cool that he's really done isn't at DC, but for some reason they really seem to value him despite him not having that reputation and cachet with fans associating DC with him. I think people will still associate him with X-Men.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's look at his overall body of work. He's had 24 full issues at DC, 12 on Batman, 12 on Superman, and then a bunch of partial issues, just a couple of pages here and there. Looking at his time at Marvel, he had 24 issues just on X-Men, at least. He had dozens of issues on Alpha Flight, on Punisher War Journal, on other titles before that. And he also was able to sell a record number of books at Marvel. That's where it really comes down to. If you look at over his Wildstorm work, there's a lot of comics there too. He probably has as many comics, individual issues drawn, probably twice as many at Wildstorm as he does at Image or at DC. I think DC really cherish his industry cachet more than his DC work product. He is their ambassador more than anything else. He is a mascot for them.
But what does he really bring to the table? Because I don't think it gives DC fans like, oh my goodness, it's Jim Lee. He did Hush. Certainly you're like, Jim Lee, he did Hush. But then you're like, oh wait, he was better on X-Men. I don't think he has that cachet specifically with DC fans. And certainly not after everything that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years with essentially him at the helm, being the guy in charge. DC is basically fallen apart. I don't understand why they value him to such a degree. They're like, we can't lose Jim Lee. Why can't you lose Jim Lee? He fucking sucks at his job right now.
Well, honestly, I'm thinking it's because they have even less behind him than him. He parlayed the sale of Wildstorm to DC into a very, very powerful role within that company. I don't know if it's just happenstance or, political machinations or whatever, but they don't have anyone behind him. Who's there? Marie Javins, who's been essentially an utter failure for the last
They got rid of Bobby Chase. They got rid of Bob Harris. They got rid of Dan Didio. They basically got rid of anybody that would have actually posed a threat to Jim Lee in his position. I don't know if it was Jim Lee's influence that made that happen, but he certainly was very lucky in the fact that anybody that could have taken this position and had the experience to do it, they got rid of besides him.
While Jim is very, very, very talented, I can't help but believe he may be the luckiest man in the history of comics, not named Stan Lee, to be in the right places at the right times with the right circumstances around him. He managed to be really, really lucky. His style became super, super popular in the 80s, that the market had kind of gone to a completely artist-driven industry at the time, where he was fighting with his writer about the direction of the book that he wanted to take. He happened to be in the right time, at the right place at the right time, with the right other people to decide to strike out on their own. He happened to be at the right place at the right time when Marvel decided that they were going to, try to win audience back by bringing Wildstorm and Extreme Studios in. He happened to be at the right place at the right time when Rob's half of that project dropped the ball so that he could take on the entire thing for the second half of it with his studio. The only thing that he has had that didn't work out for him was when he was going to end up the EIC of Marvel, and Marvel was about to buy Wildstorm. Then Ike Perlmutter and the other interest group basically froze that deal out to make sure Jim wasn't there, and Bill Jemas and those folks. That's the only thing that has not worked out into his favor. But DC said, we're buying you. We need they needed a coloring studio that Jim already had. They wanted a collected format for a bookshelf that Jim already had with the Absolute Edition. They needed designs for video games, so he did those. They needed designs to redo their universe for New 52. He's been in the right place at the right time, and then whenever everyone else is faltering, he's managed to parlay it into upward mobility for him, and good for him. Now, I don't know if this is shrewd politicking and him playing fucking chess while everyone else is playing checkers, but there seems to be a hell of a lot of luck that he's had being in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the opportunities that present itself. And right now, he did just the same with the X Office and them being in a fucking tailspin while his contract is up. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have been all that desirable of a candidate, at least not one that deserved a raise and more power.
And he got a promotion out of it. So good for Jim. There you go. He almost maybe went back to X-Men, was leveraging that probably to get a better offer from DC, because he does have a good gig. He doesn't have to work too hard. Very interesting stuff. I do want to say thank you to Dok for joining me, the world's biggest X-Men fan, to talk about this and what might have been and the legacy of Jim Lee at DC and X-Men. If you appreciate the conversation, it was a lot longer when we did it. On Dok Unfiltered, the entire unedited version of this is up on Think Critical Patreon right now. You're going to get the edited down version, but we don't get quite all the details and the breadth of information that Dok provided on there in the original broadcast. There's a link in the video description if you're interested in that.